triumphed over racial oppression through courageous protest, forging a new consensus in American life and law. But what are the effects of this celebratory storytelling? What happens when a living revolt against injustice becomes an embalmed museum piece? In this innovative work, Terry develops a novel theory of interpretation to show how competing accounts of the civil rights movement circulate through the arenas of politics and political philosophy. Ultimately, Terry argues, in contrast to both the dominant romantic narrative and new arrival Afropessimist formulations, that the civil rights movement is best understood in tragic terms. Brandon Terry is John L. Loeb Associate Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University and co-director of the Institute on Policing, Incarceration, and Public Safety at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. He is the co-editor with Tommy Shelby of To Shape a New World, Essays on the Political Philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr., and editor of 50 Years Since MLK. Terry will be joined in conversation tonight with Clint Smith. Smith is a staff writer at The Atlantic, as well as the author of the critically acclaimed book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Brandon Terry and Clint Smith.
Hello, hello. It's so wonderful to see you all. So wonderful to be here. Every time I do a book event that is my own or that has me in conversation with someone, I have to tell the crowd that it is a small miracle to me that people continue to show up for book events. I mean, we live in a moment. Brandon and I were talking over wings before this. And we were just talking about what it means to write in a moment in which there has never been more things to pull our attention away from books than there is now. Like, we literally live in a moment in which there is more stuff to do with your time than ever. You can watch any show that's ever been made. You can watch any film that's ever been done. You can listen to any song that's ever been written. And you all showed up to hear us talk about books and ideas and history. And I think we're incredibly grateful for that you took the time to do so. This is a delight for me also because I get to be in conversation with my old professor. I was, a decade ago, in 2015, a sort of low grad student in Dr. Brandon Terry's Black Politics, or what was the name? Black Power and Debates class, which was such a formative, remarkable experience for me, especially to be in that course, in that political moment, in that social moment, in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, to be in a course with someone as thoughtful and as brilliant as Brandon, to guide us through these texts, to guide us through these ideas that were in so many ways animating the moment we were living through. It shaped me as a thinker, it shaped me as a writer. And I always tell people, whenever I talk about Brandon, I'm like, this is one of the smartest dudes I've ever met in my life. And so the opportunity to be here a decade later in conversation with you is a real pleasure. I would love for you to just kind of begin by talking to us about this idea of the exemplary that you kind of write about in the context of describing the civil rights movement. So maybe you can talk about what you mean by that term, but also the way that you conceive of how it describes so much of what that era was, or how we think of what that era was.
Well, first of all, I just want to echo your thanks to everybody here, everybody online. I promise I won't get you fired by saying anything crazy. Just for tuning in and for showing up here. I see a lot of old friends, and it just means the world to me that you guys are here. I grew up not far from here in Baltimore, so it always feels like coming home. This is where we used to go out. It was a little safer over here. And to be here with Clint, I mean, it's just an extraordinary gift. You know, there are many, many wonderful things about being a professor at Harvard. It was a lot more wonderful 4 years ago. Um, but uh, but there are some wonderful things about it, but nothing tops the students. And when you get a really special student, that was the first class I ever taught, is the one Clint was in. And so, you know, you're teaching people kind of roughly around the same age, and you're trying to find your way as a professor, and you're trying to figure out how to manage a class. And then you have somebody like Clint, you know, and you're like, he's in your class, and then you're like, wait a minute, did I just see you on CNN? Did you? It's like, brother, is that your TED Talk? Yeah. And so you're just blown away. And I always remember him in that class. It was you, and then there was another person I had a class with. She was a Scandinavian pop star, and she was putting out her album in the middle of class. And I was like, wow, you like almost as famous as Clint Smith. So it's beautiful to be here, and I'm a big admirer of your work and really excited about the newest project. Clint asked me to speak about exemplarity, and that's where the book starts. I should say from the outset that I am not a historian. I am a philosopher or political theorist, and I'm interested in deeply interested in history, but I pose philosophical questions to it. And the number one question I'm interested in is, how did the civil rights movement become, and what does it mean that it is, an exemplary event in our political culture? And by that, I mean that it's something that people turn to as a touchstone for judgment. When we are trying to figure out what we mean by certain concepts that we use, like citizenship, or civil disobedience, or dissent, or protest, or racial justice, we return to that movement and tell ourselves certain stories about it to orient us. When we are trying to make judgments about what counts as being a good actor in politics, right? When it counts to do protest the right way, we try to turn back to the exemplarity of the civil rights movement. We often even use it as an exemplar or a site of exemplars for trying to be a good person, right? Bell Hooks has these beautiful phrases where she says, you know, there are a lot of people who have "what would Jesus do" on their side. I asked, what would Martin Luther King do, right? And she's deadly serious about that, right? One of the historians I quote in the book says the civil rights movement is as close to moral perfection as American political action has ever come. And so if it plays this role in our culture, I think we need to understand what is happening when people mobilize that example to do work in the world philosophically and politically. And one of the things I've drawn out from my close study of this pattern is that every time somebody's invoking the civil rights movement or bringing up the civil rights movement, they're telling you a story. They might not be telling you every detail, but they're relying on or mobilizing a certain story of the movement. And in order to understand the import of the example and the way it shapes your judgment, shapes your action, you've got to understand what kind of story they're telling.
And part of what you're doing in the book is complicating the story of the civil rights movement and asking to what extent should we be thinking of it as a moral exemplar and its actors as moral exemplars. But you're also sort of, you and the other scholars you are citing are sort of broadening the scope of what the civil rights movement was. Because many people have the civil rights movement kind of beginning in 54 with Brown v. Board, or 55 with Montgomery, then ending in 68 with the Fair Housing Act, after the death of King. But you have a different set of contours that you think about when you think about the civil rights movement. Well, can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I've been really influenced by a school of history known as the long civil rights movement. And one of the great historians of the long civil rights movement is here in the second row, Jeff Gonda, who wrote a fantastic book called Unjust Deeds about early restrictive covenant cases and how that built up a repertoire of civil rights litigation strategies. And one of the things these historians have done is challenge the periodization of the movement, not simply to just say, well, Rosa Parks has this history of activism before she sparks the Montgomery bus boycott, or that there's this really interesting history of Gandhianism amongst African American theologians that we have to understand, or where did sit-in tactics come from and how to understand their origins in the labor movement. Those are great questions, but they're not just asking for narrowly historiographical reasons. They're trying to provoke a larger conceptual transformation and political transformation in the reader. What do I mean by this? Well, the conceptual transformation is they want us to stop thinking about racial domination, racial inequality as a narrowly Southern story, right? To understand all of the ways that segregation in neighborhoods and schools is shot through the broader sweep of life in American history. The ways that employee discrimination, job place discrimination, the ways that the terror visited on Black workers who are in domestic spaces, mostly Black women, it's just such a crucial part of the domination of this period. They want you to understand that as a national story. And they also want you to understand the practice of civil rights politics as an international question. To ask you, why is it that punctuated moment that you mentioned from 54 to 68 is so intense? Well, part of that story cannot be told without understanding the peculiar leverage that the wake of World War II gave to activists and the Cold War provided. And trying to understand how to make judgments in light of that more complicated history is crucial to their historiography. So my role as a philosopher interested in these debates was to say, what are we doing when we periodize history? How do we understand when historians are making political claims or philosophical claims, trying to teach us about what we need to pay attention to, how we make judgments about what's important, how are we making moral judgments, because they often don't come right out and say it. A lot of their arguments are made in the course of storytelling, of narrative. And without a really complicated, or I should say, without an enriched understanding of narrative and the practice of narration, understanding different styles of narrative as different ways of seeing and making judgments about the world, I think we're impoverished in our reading of history. It just feels like one fact after the other. We're being dragged along a certain way of seeing the world without having that critical, reflective judgment that we need when we're trying to do politics in light of our histories.
And what is that sort of story of the civil rights movement that exists in our popular imagination? We've kind of talked about the sort of temporal demarcations of it, but what is, you cite Julius Bond, who talks about the
master narrative.
The master narrative. Can you explain what the master narrative is?
So there's a commonsensical story about the civil rights movement that this culture tells. A group of heroic, determined Black activists seize the opportunity created by the Brown versus Board of Education decision to launch a frontal assault on Jim Crow in the South. And it's a hyper-moralistic story. It's about the moral genius of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the moral transformation of the American polity toward a new consensus of anti-racism, of inclusion, of formal equality. And the story is one that I say is romantic. What do I mean by that? Well, if we take seriously the idea that history is storytelling, it shouldn't surprise us to see that it can sometimes develop some of the same genres or forms that other types of stories have: the epic, the tragic, satire, and in this case, romance. And what are romances? They're about unity in the process of becoming. So, of course, your romance novel is about the unity of your relationship, right? A romantic relationship. In this case, it's about the unity of the nation, the unity of Black people redeeming the unity of the nation. And it's a story about the triumph of essential good over inessential evil. So it's a victorious story. The civil rights movement is a victory. And it's essential victory because it shows that the promise of America could not have ended any other way. That the goodness, the triumphal character of its arc, of its deep-seated consensus and cultural resources had no other end possible but victory. And it tells a story, I think, that's deeply invested in some philosophical tasks, one of which is the idea of reconciliation. So getting us to look at our society, even though it still has deep injustices and forms of unfairness, and say, this is a society I can affirm. This is a society that I believe in. This is a society that's on the right track. And to not be so frustrated that we disavow it. And that's why people like Obama, Taylor Branch, they've become the kind of quintessential narrators of romance for this society and showing a redemptive vision. But I think that vision has a lot of problems. I think it's evasive of the deeper antagonisms in our society. It wants to tell us a story about, it wants us to tell a story about our enemies as already defeated by the course of history. So you would often hear Obama speak in the language of the right side of history, right? Or this is not who we are. But it is, in fact, who we are, in part, not in a totality, but in part. And the right side of history is a fantasy that wants victory in politics without antagonism. And here's I'll end here with just an example that I think is illustrative. One thing that romantic narrators tend to do is to describe the tendencies they oppose in politics with labels from the past, right? They'll say, these people are Nazis. These people are like the Klan. They're the John Birch Society. They're the segregationists. And they use that language on one hand, but then they never seem to actually endorse any of the politics or forms of political action that defeated those tendencies in the past. And I think that's a unique slippage, because you see that they just want the condemnation of history to do the work of politics, not persuasion, not resistance, not opposition. That's the fantasy romance gives you. And it sets you up for a fetishization of these explosive moments instead of the long, arduous building of capacity and struggle. And when the explosion doesn't come or the total victory doesn't emerge, it leaves people exhausted and suffering from a kind of despair because they were not prepared judgment-wise with the right examples to sustain their politics for the long siege.
It's interesting. You cite Obama, and I think about the part of your book where you talk about the speech he was giving at Howard.
Yeah.
And he says a version of basically, like he's speaking in this moment in which he's trying to counter a sort of Afropessimist discourse that's becoming more popular in the sort of collective consciousness of America, specifically Black America, and you know, certain writers are writing, maybe wouldn't self-identify as Afropessimists, but are writing in that tradition to varying degrees. And this is also in the midst of this is sort of, if I'm remembering correctly, maybe early days of the Black Lives Matter movement. And Obama basically gets on stage at Howard and he's like, he kind of gives this Rawlsian conception of the time in which we are in, this Rawlsian conception of justice. And he's like, basically narrating the progressive form story of the civil rights movement. And it's like, sure, America's had its problems. Sure, you know, but, you know, these were our aspirational documents. We are trying to move closer to the promise that we, you know, the sort of promissory note that King cites. And he says, But think about how all of you in this room, if you could choose to be born at any time in American history, you would choose right now. And I was like, man, that hits different now, right? Like I'm trying to imagine, like Obama couldn't ask that question
Right.
right now because he would get a different answer
Right.
than he got, 10 years ago.
And it depends on who he asked 10 years ago. The original version of that piece in there, I said, think about some of the people incarcerated. What they would say to that thought experiment. And it's this classic, Clint mentioned Rawlsian, is classic thought experiment from the great Harvard philosopher John Rawls. He says, a veil of ignorance. He's like, how would you choose a society, the kind of basic principles that would structure a society, if you didn't know who you were going to be when we removed the veil, right? You don't know if you're going to be poor or rich. You don't know if you're going to be black or white. You don't know if you'd be male or female. You just don't know. And he thought that was a way of modeling fairness, and that the principles that would result from the experiment would be a way of judging all existing forms of society to produce the most ideal, against an ideal form of justice. It was a way of challenging complacency. Mm-hmm. The Obama thought experiment is the opposite. It's about compelling complacency. It's about compelling reconciliation to the present, and not, I think what I'm trying to do in the last instance is revisit that longer story of the civil rights movement. All of these like roads not taken, these ideas that have been kind of forgotten, figures that people no longer remember, and using them to reopen the sense that this was the only settlement that's possible. This is the only thing we should be accepting of. This is the thing we should be grateful for. To try to figure out how do we get new vantage points, new spaces for judgment, to reopen that sense of possibility instead of foreclose it.
And you go on to talk about the way in which the civil rights movement, as we move forward in time, sort of loses, especially as we move into the sort of era of the Black Lives Matter movement, broadly defined, loses some of the moral exemplarity that made it what it was in our collective imagination, that there's a disillusionment,
yes,
especially from young Black activists, that begins to manifest itself in opposition to many of the perceived sensibilities of the civil rights movement. Can you talk about the ways in which that starts to show up and why?
Sure. The way I put it in the book, and here is why I think this language of romance is really helpful. The romantic narrative had two impacts that the Black Lives Matter generation drew out. And I think those are two of its really big philosophical contributions, a serious philosophical contribution. So one is to say that the romantic narrative of the civil rights movement has become ideological. And by that, I just mean that it serves to lift up and protect forms of injustice and delegitimize struggles against it. So the charge that many in the Black Lives Matter movement kept making was that people are waving around the civil rights movement as a way of telling us we're not doing it right, telling us to get off the streets, telling us that our form of protest is too uncivil or not appropriately timed, or our forms of action are not properly organized or ordered. And they're not doing it in good faith, right? It's not people who have just a serious investment in the tactical manual produced by Bayard Rustin to organize the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That's not why they're saying it, right? They're saying it to get you to go home, get you to accept what Derek Chauvin did, right? So there's that problem. Then there's the other problem of alienation, which is a deeper one. Is the way in which a too romantic narrative, a too heroic, transcendent narrative can actually cause you to feel disempowered because you can't live up to the myth we've created. How could I be the Dr. King we tell ourselves walked the earth? right? How can we live up to the mythologies we've created? So it creates a sense that it's not even worth trying, or that the only way to find some kind of freedom is to react with utter hostility, to say, this isn't your grandfather's civil rights movement, to be dismissive. You know, I was just with one of the activists from Ferguson a couple of days ago, and he was talking about that quote, which he had made famous. And he said, you know, in retrospect, I don't think we understood the courage of our grandfathers and grandmothers and the things that they had to do and were prepared to do. And all I would add to that is just because they were alienated from the example. It was a way of stopping or foreclosing a possibility of reflective judgment for people to really revisit that history and understand it in a way that would be actionable in the present. That myth actually short-circuited that possibility with the romantic character of it.
It's interesting because in so many ways there are kind of echoes of a point that I try to make a lot in my work, but with a different set of historical figures, right? So in How the Word Is Passed, I open with Jefferson and Monticello. Yeah. And part of what I argue is that, you know, I go to Monticello because in many ways Jefferson embodies the cognitive dissonance of the American project. Yep. America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways their own ancestors could have never imagined. And it has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And that both of those things are the story of America. In the same way that Jefferson, I think, sort of personifies that moral inconsistency, because he is the person who drafted the Declaration of Independence, you know, one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world, but also enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children. He wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia that Black people are inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. Said Phyllis Wheatley, the sort of foremother of African-American letters, that her work was beneath the dignity of criticism, that it wasn't even worth engaging with because he didn't think that Black people had the intellectual or emotional capacity, the artistic acumen with which to create beautiful things. And so I think about what it means to, you know, for Monticello to tell a more complicated, a less romantic story of who Jefferson was, of what the founding was. And I think the point, the necessary point, is that in telling a fuller story of who Jefferson was, then you tell a fuller story of our founding. Mm-hmm. And in telling a fuller story of our founding, you get a fuller story of our present, right? Because then you begin to understand the contradictions that are embedded within the founding project, and you more fully understand and can see the contradictions that remain. And so in the context of the civil rights movement, it almost becomes a similar thing in the sort of romanticism of it, where we make the movement and then King as the figurehead into this demigod, you know, status. Yeah. And the movement itself as a sort of almost otherworldly moral paradigm, in ways, to your point, that make it feel wholly removed from like the ordinary human experience. Right. And as a result, people are not, they have a misconstrued notion of it, which I think is just the same, because the civil rights movement was messy. It was messy.
Absolutely.
King was messy.
Yes.
And I think that it's so important, and part of what you're doing so well and so importantly in this book is saying we don't have to hold it up here for it to be something that can remain. Like, there's almost a different iteration of exemplar it can be.
That's it.
Right? Like we call it has become an exemplar, but in a way that actually makes it feel less attainable. But it can be actually an exemplar, right? Because if we understood the humanness and the messiness and the moral contradictions and the arguments that were embedded within that movement, the flaws embedded within the leaders of that movement, then we could use it as an exemplar in a different way.
Exactly.
And say, oh, actually, we can do that because, like, we're messy like them.
Right.
We're ordinary like them.
Right.
We're, you know.
And to just bring home the the genuine character of the choices. So in the one of the pieces I dwell on in the section on tragedy and tragic history is when the SCLC is debating about whether to permit or whether to invite the children of Birmingham to march. And we all see that as like, that's part of the heroic story of the civil rights movement. That's like this heroic moment, the kids take the street. Martin Luther King locked himself in the room and could not get out of the bed to actually make the decision. He was so horrified by the weightiness, the tragic choice, the idea that two good things are not going to happen at once here, right? We can either save the struggle in Birmingham and defend the power of nonviolent direct action and keep this version of the civil rights movement alive. But to do that, we're going to have to put children at risk. As pastors, we could watch some kids die today.
And that it would be our choice.
And that it would be our fault. Of course, complex in a moment of deep rationality, we'll say, no, it's not exactly my fault. But it's kind of your fault. And everyone said it. Malcolm X said it. John F. Kennedy said it. Hannah Arendt said it. He said, what are you people doing? This is insanity. But that's the tragic character of what people go through in contentious politics against extraordinary injustice and enduring injustice. And so, again, to tell it not as some neat, melodramatic, triumphalist story, but one that really takes seriously that there are debates, there's dissensus, there are good things that can't all happen at once. There are losses that come as part of the victories, right? There are people, I interviewed Ruby Bridges about 2 years ago now. And many people don't know, her parents' marriage did not survive the choice to integrate the schools. They were divorced in a time where divorce was not that prevalent within 2 years of the decision to do that. It ripped their family apart. We all are like, it's heroic. We give her awards and all these things, and it is heroic. But there was loss there too. And how do you tell a story that keeps track of both of those things at once?
How do you think about, so much of what you do in your work in this book, in your work with Tommy Shelby, broadly over the last several years, is to track the histories of these social movements, and to look at them in a way that is clear-eyed, to look at them in a way that does not romanticize them, in a way that sort of takes them serious, takes the thinkers seriously as thinkers, as intellectuals. So much of what you and Tommy's anthology that came out a few years ago is say, let's take King seriously, not simply as an activist, not simply as a pastor, not simply as a leader, but like as a philosopher, as a thinker, as an intellectual himself. We have lived through 10 years, of the 10-ish years of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we're in a very different political moment now. This is kind of asking you to extend from the work you've done in the book to our current political moment, but what does Black movement making, Black struggle, the Black liberation movement, what does it look like now, based on your sense of history, based on the conversations you have with activists? Like, what does it mean for there to be a Black liberation struggle in a political moment which is in so many ways vastly different than the civil rights movement, in part because of the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement, it was Kennedy, JFK and Bobby Kennedy relative, and now it's Trump and Stephen Miller and J.D. Vance, right? And those are two fundamentally different, like, if part of the civil rights movement is meant to compel the consciousness of those in the executive branch, or put pressure on those in the executive branch because of pressure that you're putting on the sort of broader body politic. What does movement making mean in a moment where there is no sympathy from the executive branch, where actually that is perhaps the most antagonistic force that is animating our politics today?
So let me break this apart. So the first question about thinking about these movements as full of thinkers. Again, here's where, this is a very insidious way that romantic history works. So if you think that all we're doing when we talk about Black politics is basically tracking people who are making the founding documents or the American creed come true, they don't have any ideas. All they're doing is saying the things we all already believe, but they might say it with rhetorical flair. They might dramatize it in some cinematic way, but they're not original. And so there's a lot of this book that's about Gunnar Myrdal, the great social scientist who wrote American Dilemma. And he would write these things about Black politics. He's like, these people don't have any ideas. And thank God, because they've already been given the greatest idea that there is, the American creed, right? And that's stunning to me. And I often feel like, when Du Bois wrote Black Reconstruction, he said, I'm going to start with the simple premise that Black people are human beings. And therefore, this book will look a lot different than the other things that are out, right? I'm going to treat them as human beings. They're not perfect, but they're also not subhuman, right? And the same thing is true here. It's like the idea that people aren't thinking, that Martin Luther King could just give a speech that makes people go out and risk death. He's making arguments. He's trying to persuade people, right? The book takes its title from a sermon he gives called Shattered Dreams. It's published the same year that I Have a Dream is published. But instead of I Have a Dream is about, what do you do with the fact that many of the things you want to see in the world will not come true in your lifetime? Does it make your striving for something better to exist worthless because you're going to fail at it? Du Bois called it a splendid failure when he was talking about Reconstruction. What does it mean to be a splendid failure? Right? So these are people making real arguments. And so much of the generative quality of my work over time, I think, has been because I really take these people seriously as intellectuals. And we had a great conversation earlier about how many Black political figures started newspapers, right? Just tons and tons of discourse where people are trying to work out complicated problems about race and class. So that leads to the second point, which is when you think about the present, I think one of the things a long vision of the civil rights movement really does for you is to say, no, you don't start with Lyndon Johnson. You don't start with John F. Kennedy on June 11th, 1963, which is a different John F. Kennedy than before that, right? You're starting with Woodrow Wilson, who's like, making America great again. We're going to bring Jim Crow back to D.C. right here, right? We're going to show you Birth of a Nation at the White House. And you have to look that in the face and say, where do we go? The catastrophe of World War I, the rise of Woodrow Wilson, the enthusiasm for the white government of South Africa, which is back. The white rule over South Africa, there's enthusiasm for that again. You have to look at it and say, how do we build from what feels like utter devastation? Mass lynchings, pogroms, segregation. So what are we drawing our attention to? I'll try to just say, I could say a million things, but I'll say three things that I think might help. So one is, part of the book is inspired by kind of long philosophical discussions of judgment. because I think politics is really about judgment. And exemplarity is about judgment. How do we think about a particular case and turn it into something more general, something that might guide us in the present? And the greatest philosopher of judgment is Immanuel Kant. And he would often write about the difference between imitation and emulation. So imitation in art is like, I take something beautiful, I trace it, run to my parents and be like, what a great artist I am. He said, no, you didn't tap into anything that inspired this artwork. You're not asking the questions this person asked. You're not thinking about the context that you're responding to. You're not trying to produce a great aesthetic idea. You have just imitated greatness. Emulation is different. It's trying to return to the questions, with a sense of the complicated cultural and aesthetic regime that you inhabit in your moment of creativity, and trying to bring something brilliant out of that. So you can be emulating somebody and produce a work that looks nothing like it. You understand this as a writer, right? And that's what I'm calling for with our exemplarity of the civil rights movement. So much of what we do is rote imitation. It often feels like civil rights movement dinner theater. There's nothing dangerous about it. It doesn't seem to have any uptake in the world. And part of it is because you're not asking the kind of questions that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee asks when they're doing the sit-ins. You're not asking a question that Martin Luther King is asking in Birmingham. You're not asking the questions that Fannie Lou Hamer is asking when she takes the stage at the 1964 Democratic Convention, right? You're not asking, what could possibly pierce through this attention regime? What could make it feel dangerous? What stereotypes are held against our group? And how can we transgress them in a productive way, right? When you read Stride Toward Freedom, Martin Luther King's first book, or the early Malcolm X stuff, the most striking thing about all of that is they say the number one stereotype against Black people is that they are passive and accept any humiliation or form of domination without resistance. So when you have something like these well-coordinated protest movements, people standing in the face of the police, it destroys that stereotype. It may be the only anti-Black stereotype that no longer exists, right? It may be the only one, not lack of intelligence, sexual licentiousness, anything else. Maybe the only one that was actively destroyed by a concerted act of politics. So trying to go back to that moment of emulation is really important. And I also think, I'll be briefer here, is paying attention to the international context and the way it might allow for certain points of leverage and pressure. So I talk a lot about civil rights as a realist movement, one that's concerned with power and leverage in a way that is very uncomfortable for people who want to see it as simply immoralism. And bringing up, I think, especially in this moment, a better way of characterizing the forces that we're up against and the ideals that we defend. So the book ends in part with a call for a reviving of the political philosophy of integrationism, that we're actually up against people who are soft segregationists, right? They are people who do not see value in diversity. They're people who don't see value in reparative justice, right? And they're people who treat Black people in positions of competence or status as presumptively illegitimate. Those three things seem to me to be a kind of soft segregationism, right? And when you add on it the immigration enforcement, things like that, well, what can be against that? You need an ideal of integrationism that's very well fleshed out, that has political philosophic warrant, that has normative justifications to organize people against it. That may not be the right language. I experiment with different languages in the book, but calling people back to that tradition to do that work of argument and persuasion, I think, is really crucial in this moment.
I want to give people the opportunity to ask questions themselves. If you have a question, there's a microphone right here behind this pillar. Please feel free to come up. We got about 10, 15 minutes left. So if you have a question, come on up. Don't feel scared. We're both teachers, so we know about wait time. We'll just sit here and wait. But as we wait for folks to come up, I do want to say that like I'm really struck by the, like, that was the perfect illustration of why taking the long view is so important, right? Because then you're not actually beginning with JFK, you're beginning with Ridgel, and that creates an entirely different set of frameworks. Because then you have to think about, oh, well, what sort of political choices were Black people making, and electoral choices were Black people making around, Nixon and JFK, and in what way was that informed by this sort of longer understanding of Black struggle? And so that's something I'm gonna be thinking about, because I often, because I've been taught about the civil rights movement in a particular way, I often think of it beginning with a sort of, Bobby Kennedy being like, "Hey guys, like, come on,
Yeah,
like,
what do you think?
we're all friends here."
Yeah, right.
And it can make this moment feel more overwhelming, because it's like, oh, nobody's doing that
No.
now. But if you recognize it as beginning before that, then I think it helps you take that longer view and say, oh, well, this is what exists now, but we don't know what sort of administration is coming after, and what sort of possibilities that will create for a coming movement. Go ahead.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much. I'm going to try to be coherent. I am a Ralph Ellison scholar, specifically focusing on the novel that he worked on for some 40 years, beginning in the mid-50s as a response to the current moment of deseg as it was beginning, but that he never finished by the time he died in 94. Ellison was obsessed with tragedy as a category. He was also obsessed with comedy, and that's one way of explaining why the blues is so important to him, is it's tragic comedy. Yep. But particularly in that, let's say, first 20 years of working on the novel, mid-50s to mid-70s, like, tragedy is the mode he's trying to operate in.
Yeah.
Because he's interested in tragedy as a technology of transformation, and he's essentially interested in writing for, and I use this word deliberately, like non-Negroes, like people who do not come from that historical experience, that would understand contra Hannah Arendt, like why the parents in Little Rock sent their children to Central High, right? So as you were talking, I mean, again, I'm thinking about a lot, but I'm curious about when Ellison is picking up on other theorists about tragedy, he's interested in as a technology of transformation, like what the cathartic moment does. Like, he was trying to write a novel in which the main character was going to be so, and these are his words, worthy of sacrifice, like a biography of a character was going to be made so worthy of sacrifice to the general reader, that by the end of the novel, that reader would be somehow purified through the catharsis of this character's death, that they would essentially support the movement, right, and be more willing to be in an integrated society. So I'm curious, like, as you look at this long history, when I throw out these terms like catharsis, technology of transformation, like, how do you see it operating?
That's great.
Because, yeah, I mean, there's a lot there, but I'm just really curious. How does that work?
So let me say a couple of things. One is that, Ellison pops up at various places in the book, and I am, I think you'll see, very influenced by my colleague Danielle Allen, who has used Ralph Ellison's work on tragic comedy to talk about some of the dilemmas of democratic citizenship, but why she thinks it's still worthwhile project to be committed to democracy, and thinking really hard about sacrifice. So that's certainly a thing I'm interested in. For me, because I'm starting with the question of narrative, I'm really interested in drawing out what I think are the unique features of tragic storytelling. And so for me, they're really kind of fourfold. One is the idea that there are serious conflicts that cannot always be resolved, right? Romance is about overcoming conflict. Comedy is about dissolving conflict and realizing that the conflict wasn't really what you thought it was all along. Tragedy is like, no, they're real. And he's antagonist. And it leads to the second point, which is that death and defeat are always the horizon of tragedy. So that real loss is part of how we have to tell this story. We can't skate over it. We can't put it off to the side. We can't incorporate it heroically or sacrificially into a story about a pageantry of progress. I love August Wilson's Fences because I think it's one of the few works that show somebody who's deeply resentful that their child has more opportunities than they had, which I think is real and is not given enough voice. Like, people aren't always happy to just be like, oh man, all my opportunities were gone, but you're great, right? You know, my father grew up in Cherry Hill, the worst segregated housing project in Baltimore, next to a landfill where they foraged for food. Me and him learned to read at the same time, okay? The fact that I have all these opportunities to go to Oxford or Yale, that doesn't make anything about his situation just or resolved or redeemed. He suffered unfairly, and you have to name that loss. Last thing is, I think tragedy is about contingency, ironically. So many people think it's about fate, but fate is just dramatizing the sense that being able to act in certain ways under certain descriptions dissolves. That the more and more we act, certain possibilities are possible, certain things aren't. And trying to understand that contingency means the last thing is that we're responsible to act anyway, because we don't know. The romantic wants us to believe that everything is going to work out in the end. The ironist, the pessimist tells us nothing we do is worthwhile. The tragic says we have to act without guarantees. And beyond that, we have to be mature enough. That's why King brings up maturity in his speech on Vietnam. We have to be mature enough to try to attend to the unintended consequences of our action and repair the things that we've done wrong in the past. So that requires a certain kind of historical consciousness. And I think those are the key features of a tragic narrative. When people have that in mind when they're writing, the histories look radically different. The types of things they think are significant are radically different. And I'm trying to bring that to self-consciousness in the historiography.
Thank you.
Hi. Okay, so I'm older, obviously. I was on SNCC staff in Mississippi, Alabama, Southwest Georgia, okay. I also worked on all 14 hours of Eyes on the Prize, and I continued to film, make, and educate and all that stuff.
Fantastic.
I loved everything you said. However, not a however, no.
It's all right.
In addition.
I can take a however.
No, however.
From you, I'll take a however.
I love the idea that we're trying to figure out how to balance the amazing thing, because, I mean, the movement was amazing to all of us, right? How you balance that with when I go into a classroom or college, wherever I am, and I say, well, you know, in Eyes on the Prize, it makes it seem like when in the footage that you've got suddenly, you know, 3 people in a mass meeting, and then suddenly you've got 20,000 people marching across the Pettus Bridge, right? No, never happened. And that sometimes you would have those 3 people, your co-organizer and her mother for 6 months.
Right.
That would be the mass meeting, right? But how you balance that, and you can talk about, you know, what you were talking about. They're splitting. SNCC is splitting. It's Ms. Baker who calls them and says, look, y'all got to figure this out, right? But the question is, how do you balance that so that they get the magnificence of it and the fact that we're all still doing stuff? You know, I'm not sitting doing baby booties, you know. I mean, that we're all doing these amazing things because of how we were grounded in the movement, specifically for me in SNCC. I was 19 when I went in. So how do you balance that with the reality of, you know, and the intelligence? I love that you were saying that, because in Mississippi in '64, when we're talking about the Mississippi State Constitution, we're asking the kids in the freedom schools, okay, does this work for you? Does it work for poor white people who are your neighbors? And okay, if it doesn't work for you, how would you reimagine the state constitution? So I love that you're talking. Anyway, my question is, how do you balance that? Okay.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for, I mean, just your extraordinary work as an activist and as an educator. I think it's the hardest question of our time. And, you know, one of the things that's difficult about the style that I write in, which is very philosophical, is it's like when philosophers write about art, you know, artists say, well, you know, this is all well and good, but you could never produce the art, right? And I'm a bit in that situation with history, that, you know, I say things that I think illuminate history, bring out of concealment some of the moral commitments and ethical commitments and political commitments of a style of history writing, and I think put them on firmer ground so people don't have to be so apologetic about trying to write and think like this and can have something to say against the people who criticize it. But if you told me, how to make the film, right, that's much harder. And I just hope that my little part of it, I mean, one of the great things about the civil rights movement is division of labor, right? So everybody can't do everything, and so I just hope my part of it is a contribution to helping people experiment with different stories. So some of the people that I write about are people who haven't been the focus of these things, like A. Philip Randolph, the great labor organizer who is the architect of the March on Washington. Spent a lot of time talking about his trajectory and his thinking, because he's just not a person we spend a lot of time with. And what would it mean for him to be more central in our storytelling about the movement? So trying to pose those kind of questions, I think, is the right way. And having that language of tragedy to just say, here's a venerable tradition of storytelling that focuses seriously on loss, on defeat, on partial victory, on mourning, but never says that the whole thing wasn't worth it. Because that's the last ditch thing you're trying to avoid against. It's only tragic if it's worth mourning, right? That's what makes it tragic, is that something valuable is at stake.
This will be our last question.
Thank you. Thank you for this discussion. You talked about at the very end about the ideal of integrationism. And I assume that I haven't read your book, so I assume you talk about it in there. I'm wondering if in the classes you teach, what the reaction of students is to that idea. That's my question.
Well, I should turn it over to my former students who are in the class. Yeah, that's really interesting. So I'll say two things here. One is that I think unfortunately, and I put it to varying degrees of politeness in the book, I think unfortunately, there's a way in which Black nationalism has become symbolic of a kind of radical chic. And that, there are all sorts of reasons why that might be the case. It seems less compromising. It seems more militant. It's open to violence often, not always, but often. And there has a veneer of radicalism. And I think one of the great difficulties of the history of the left in this country has been its inability to think really sophisticatedly about Black nationalism. And so there are students who imagine themselves as reflecting some kind of radical position, who I think accept it or valorize it without really understanding what it intellectually would commit you to. And that many of the transformations you claim to want to see in the world about political economy, about the structure of government, about the way we treat one another, about foreign policy, they require one fundamental acknowledgement above all, which is that we live in a mutual garment of destiny. We are interdependent. There is no singular solo path to freedom. Just not what freedom means. Now that is tragic because it means we're not sovereign, and that my life, which I value in an extraordinary amount, my kids' lives, which I value even more than mine, are dependent on what all of you do.
Right.
That's horrifying.
Right. I would agree.
It is. It's
Yeah,
existentially terrifying to just say it out loud that, like, my kids' lives depend on what you do every day. And there are lots of reasons for that fear to lead you to more or less sophisticated versions of evasion of that fundamental fact of the human condition. And so what I try to do with my students is take the Black nationalist tradition deadly serious. That was our class. I study it. That's the tradition I came out of. And I have been transformed in part by reading people who were sympathetic critics, and taking seriously, and this is a lot of what the book is about, taking seriously what was the great failure of integrationism as political philosophy. And it has many great failures, one of which is that it was too self-satisfied in the contrast with Black nationalism, right? That, in the way we hand out jobs and prestige and things, all you had to do was be against Black nationalism and your position seemed reasonable, right? You didn't have to ask very hard questions about, here's some fundamental basic questions about integrationism as a way of thinking. Integration would have to go across many different domains. What are the relationships between those? Is it more important to start with schools? Is it more important to start with neighborhoods? Is it more important to start with employment, right? What's the point of integrationism? Is it about individual freedom that just, very successful, famous Black writers can live in whatever neighborhood they want without being discriminated against? Or that Black people who can afford it can buy $7 oranges at Whole Foods without being bothered? Is that the goal, right? Or is it something different? Is it about a coalition that might transform and produce an egalitarian transformation of our society? And that simply because that can't be done without that, it requires building a new civil society that's integrated. It can't have people who have suspicions and stereotypes and no ties. So we're just not asking basic questions like that any longer. And so if anything, I hope that the book contributes to a revival, right? There are other people who do this work, Elizabeth Anderson, Sharon Stanley, philosophers who've been thinking about integrations, but I hope it's another spur and perhaps one that speaks directly to your question, which is to make it seem like it's okay to name that and pursue that without getting stamped with a badge of being uncool.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody, please give a round of applause for Brandon Terry. I have also counted how many of you are here, and so I'm gonna ask Politics and Prose later how many books were purchased to make sure it's commensurate with, I'm kidding, I'm not gonna shame you, but don't be the person who comes to the book talk and doesn't buy the book. Don't be that. But thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Brandon, for this.
Thank you so much, Clint.
This is what it was like to be in class with him all the time. It was amazing. You're just like, oh God. And so this was a delight. And shout out to Politics and Prose for hosting.
Thank you so much.